I wanted to basically try to cover two things today, actually a third that I'll tell you about at the end, but we probably won't have time and I don't have it ready in any event. Um, One is to talk about, we talked about economic inequality and how economic inequality feeds into a political instability and social instabilities. But it's actually, when we talk about politics in particular, it's actually uh, a geographical issue or problem. The economic inequality we see is also a regional inequality. Um, there's a study that was done just 2 years ago after Donald Trump won the 2016 election. Um, all the liberal academics scurried off into the countryside trying to figure out what had happened. And so they started studying all sorts of issues, but this is a study that was done by the Brookings Institution called Countering the Geography of Discontent, Strategies for Left Behind Places. And what they discovered during this study was that it used to be, an economic theory is that regional differences in terms of jobs and wages, investment, business formation ought to equalize because resources will flow from the higher priced areas into the lower priced areas and tend to equalize out. So presumably under classic economic theory, disparities between regions, particularly in a single market like the United States, would diminish. And that was generally true up until recent years, recent decades. And in the last 20 or 30 years, that convergence has turned into a divergence. The metropolitan and non-metropolitan areas are moving apart in terms of their prosperity. And part of it is due to globalization, part of it's due to technology, but there clearly is a growing divergence, at least a growing divergence as of 2018, between rural and urban areas. Now, one thing that the economic, during the Trump administration up until the pandemic started, the growth that was engendered had significantly, well, I don't know how much of a change it was, but it had begun to narrow that diversion somewhat. But over the last decade, most of the growth in this country has been concentrated in urban hubs. And at least as of 2018, many small towns and rural areas had not yet recovered from the 2008-2009 financial crisis. There's another book that I won't bring into this discussion talking about the consequences of the financial crisis. But suffice it to say that the financial crisis in 08 and 09 hurt less affluent people more than the more affluent, and less affluent areas more than the more affluent areas. And that financial crisis still, the effects of it are still echoing in some areas. One of the reasons why these areas don't converge, in other words, why workers in rural areas don't move into cities for the jobs that are available in cities, is because they can't afford to live in the cities. They can't afford the rents, they can't afford to buy housing. And so the housing costs in urban areas are a barrier to these rural and non-metropolitan areas equalizing with the metropolitan areas. And up until recently, neither the academy nor the government had really focused much on what are now called place-sensitive policies to try to address these urban and rural divisions. As the author of this study wrote, many have failed to realize that the economic divide fueling our political conflict may not be between the poorest and the richest members of society, but between the prosperous and lagging regions. And we'll come back to that. But some evidence: indexed wage growth from 1969 to 2016, it's been 165% in the top 2% of the metro areas, but less than 150% in the whole rest of the nation. And that divergence began in the late 1990s and it's accelerated after 2000. Employment growth from 2008 to 2017 has been nearly 8.5%. This is employment growth in metropolitan areas of greater than 1 million, 4.5% in metropolitan areas with a population between 250,000 and 1 million. Slightly more than 2%, you see it's going down, in metropolitan areas with population between 50 and 250,000. A negative 2% in rural areas adjacent to metropolitan areas, and a nearly negative 4% in rural areas not adjacent to metropolitan areas. And there are wage disparities between highly skilled workers in larger metropolitan areas from those in smaller metropolitan areas. Now a lot of that might be attributable to cost of living differences, but the same is true for lower skilled and service workers. Even with people with similar skills, there's a divergence in the level of compensation between the metropolitan and non-metropolitan areas. And one of the causes I mentioned before was a vast expansion of global trade, particularly what this report refers to as the period of Chinese import penetration. That happened, China was admitted to the WTO, the World Trade Organization, in 2001, and it has it has prospered. Its trade situation has prospered, and to the detriment of a lot of smaller communities in the Midwest and the Southeast that had that were dependent on clusters of vulnerable, lower productivity manufacturing industries. And I think what sometimes those of us in the Northeast and in the prosperous metropolitan areas don't appreciate is the severity of that dislocation and shock. The other cause of the disparity, or another cause of the divergence between metropolitan areas and non-metropolitan, is the spread of the digital economy. And that economy has provided greater economic benefits to the highly educated and those that are able to master that technology, and those who don't have those skills. And another phenomenon that's occurred is that as areas begin to prosper, it's a reinforcing sort of virtuous cycle. So as more and more industries and workers with certain skills collect in a given area, they attract more industry. So Silicon Valley attracts workers who then are trained. Those workers attract other tech industries to come in. Those industries attract more workers. And it's a virtuous circle for that area, at least until some of the burdens of growth start to dampen the effect. There were policy changes that we made. I mentioned that have sort of fostered this economic geographical division. As I mentioned, the Chinese admission to the World Trade Organization in 2001. I'll mention another thing here. Well, no, I won't go into the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We have, the United States made a very determined effort to promote free trade, even at the expense of some of our own home industries. And so Trump's complaints about what NAFTA did and what other free trade policies did were based on a reality that those policies did produce adverse results, particularly in these non-metropolitan or non-major metropolitan areas, because those who gained from that free trade were principally the elite or the meritocracy or the highly educated, whatever label you want to put on them. Another thing that we've done in the public policy realm is we deregulated markets, and we moved more and more to free markets, which I think, at least when we started to make the move, I think was a good thing to do. We may have gone to the other extreme of that process, but back in 1978, Jimmy Carter, and I think it was Ted Kennedy, pushed the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978 through Congress. Now, what that act did is it deregulated the airlines, but the prior regulatory regime had required airlines to serve non-major metropolitan areas. And they couldn't cut routes, even if the route wasn't profitable. They had to cross-subsidize. They had to subsidize their less profitable routes from their more profitable routes, and therefore keeping air service to the non-major metropolitan areas more available. When the airlines were deregulated and price controls were lifted, and the airlines over time organized themselves into the hub and spoke structure that we have now, which provides demonstrably less service to the rural areas and non-metropolitan areas. In the area of interstate banking, it used to be that a bank couldn't branch across state lines. So it effectively forced all banks, or most banks, commercial banks, to operate on a state-by-state basis. So each state had its own local banks that served that community. Well, Bill Clinton helped put through an Interstate Banking and Branching Efficiency Act in 1994. The effect of that was to launch a 20, 30-year process of consolidation in the banking industry, which we saw here in Delaware, to the point where now most communities are like Wilmington and Delaware, and we have only one local bank. And what difference does it make? I think that they've done studies to show that the banks that were situated within a single state or a single community tended to reinvest the deposits at that bank in loans to that community. National banks don't operate in the same way, and therefore a lot of communities that aren't part of major metropolitan areas where the major banks are either headquartered or principally located don't have the same access to commercial loans and investment capital. In fact, I was involved in an effort that really didn't, it was hoped that it would have effect, but I don't think it had much of an effect, where we were trying to set up structures so that venture capital funds, the funds that invest in startup businesses, mostly had concentrated most of their investments in startup businesses on the coast. And we were trying to set up a program to promote venture capital funds providing seed capital to startup businesses in non-major metropolitan areas and in rural areas. And while there was a lot of talk, there was probably not a lot of results. The other thing we've seen is decreasing antitrust enforcement, which has resulted in tremendous consolidation just about in every industry. And I think it's fair to say that markets generally have a tendency towards consolidation. And therefore, in the absence of antitrust enforcement, you're going to find markets that are increasingly dominated by a few competitors. But what that also does is mean that local businesses have a very difficult time competing with, the perfect example, Walmart. And it used to be, under the Wright-Patman Act, that businesses were prevented from price competition in certain markets, so that the big out-of-state business or the big foreign business couldn't come in and undercut the prices of local competitors. But those laws were repealed, and the effect has been to consolidate the retail industry and make it more and more difficult for small retail to survive. Now, as the country pulled apart economically, it also pulled apart politically. Parties that once crossed geographical lines now concentrate on metropolitan versus non-metropolitan areas. And these are two quotes from the study. One is, and while compelling research has underlined the strong role of racial and xenophobic cultural factors in explaining backlash politics, it has become clear that the backlash also has geographic and economic dimensions. Making matters even worse, these political divisions mirror widening differences between diverse, liberal, internationally minded cities and more homogeneous, conservative, and locally focused small towns and rural areas, spawning a new culture war. And I think I remember in 2009 and 2010, I made a prediction to anybody who would listen to me, and there weren't many people who would, probably for good reason. But I predicted we were going to have a populist backlash, and this was back in 2008. And I said that the only question is, we're going to have one. The only question is whether it's going to be led from the right or from the left. And we know what happened. But part of the debate that we had at that time was whether the growing populist movement on the right, whether that was solely a phenomenon of racism, and therefore solely or largely or mostly a phenomenon of racism, so that any effort to appeal to these people that were appealed to these right-wing populist movements would be fruitless unless the Democratic Party was going to abandon all sense of principle, or whether those groups were in part there for geographic and economic reasons, in which case the Democratic Party could make an appeal to them that might have some meaningful effect. I think it's fair to say that Hillary Clinton's campaign, although it talked about making that kind of outreach, really didn't. Whereas Joe Biden's campaign made a more concerted, intentional effort to reach those groups. And I haven't studied the results of the 2020 election enough to know what it proves or disproves in terms of that strategy. But that's of some significance to those of us who have a preference in terms of party. The other thing, in terms of the political divide, the density of the area you live in, or the density of an area, has become increasingly the most correlated factor. In other words, if you look at all the factors that would cause you to predict how a group of people would vote, the factor that seems to have the highest degree of correlation is the density of the area that they live in. So Hillary Clinton won 472 counties in 2016 compared to the 2,584 captured by Donald Trump. But the counties Clinton won represented 64% of the aggregate GDP. So just in those statistics, I think you can get a glimpse of the geographic divide and the economic divide. And then I've quoted two columnists and a law professor, or a columnist and a law professor, on the effect that this geographic economic divide has had on politics in terms of, to a certain extent, radicalizing those groups. And I like this second quote, or the quote on the bottom. He says that areas that have witnessed long periods of decline, migration, and brain drain, those that have seen better times and remember them with nostalgia, those that have been repeatedly told that the future lays elsewhere, have used the ballot box as their weapon. That statement also sort of reflects Michael Moore's discussion of Donald Trump back in 2016 that became so famous. So I think that if the kinds of political trends that led us to the extremism that we saw last week, that was enabled by a political establishment that now attempts to decry those groups, even while enabling them. If we're going to stem that tide, we have to figure out how to cross this geographical, economical divide. And the divide we're talking about in terms of geography and economy is not unique to the United States. The same divide occurs in other parts of what used to be, or what is, Western civilization, at least Western Europe. The Leave vote in the Brexit referendum negatively correlated with population density. In other words, the lower density areas would vote more for Leave than the higher metropolitan areas. And over 50% of the rural voters in England and Wales favored exit from the European Union, while the metropolitan voters and Scotland opposed it. In what I think is the most recent French presidential election, when Marie Le Pen ran before 2018, I can't frankly remember if there has been one since then, but Marie Le Pen is the sort of right-wing proto-fascist, the daughter of Le Pen, who started a right-wing party in France. And she ran, and I think got the second highest number of votes against Emmanuel Macron. But her base was largely rural and his was largely urban. In Hungary and Poland right now, which are the sites of extreme authoritarian right-wing reaction, I hate calling it populist because I think that gives populism a bad name that I don't think it should have. But at least in Hungary and Poland, those which are taking those countries so much towards dictatorship that the EU is trying to impose, and they're part of the EU, trying to impose sanctions on them now for their divergence from basic EU governance principles. But those are, again, rural-driven political movements. So the phenomenon that we're seeing between economic division and geographical division is not unique to the United States. And then this article ends with the proposition that we must discard economic myopia in favor of a broader view of costs and benefits. Of course, this was before the pandemic even. Leaving struggling places to fend for themselves may reduce public outlays today, only to increase them tomorrow as a consequence of the neglect, as the consequences of neglect manifest themselves in increased costs for healthcare, disability, and substance abuse. But now, with the pandemic,
Hi.
I'm
sorry. I'll try.
Now, with the money that we're spending on the pandemic, a question arises, well, where does the money come from? How are we going to do all the things we need to do? And that gets us into, or should get us into, if I had time, a discussion of what's called the new monetarism, which I think is really the old monetarism. Understanding how money is created and understanding how when the federal government issues debt to raise money, a lot of that debt is purchased by the Federal Reserve Bank itself, which is a part of the federal government. The Federal Reserve Bank manufactures or creates money to buy that debt. And so when interest payments come due on that U.S. debt, the U.S. government makes the interest payment to the Federal Reserve. When the debt principal comes due, the U.S. government pays the debt principal to the Federal Reserve. And that at the end of every year, the Federal Reserve, after taking out money to pay its own operating expenses, takes all that money in interest and principal that was paid to it by the U.S. government and pays it back to the U.S. government. That's called monetizing the debt, and there's a growing debate that is going to be hugely consequential for the future of this country as to whether there is a limit on the amount of money that the Federal Reserve can create in terms of buying up the government debt that's being issued to fund programs. And if there is a limit, where is it? So a lot of the solutions for what we're talking about turn on that financial question and that monetary question. I think that conventional wisdom is becoming that the Federal Reserve has much greater flexibility in terms of creating money than we ever appreciated, without creating inflation and without devaluing the dollar. The other thing I wanted to mention is taken from an article and a book written by a Yale law professor. The article's Meritocracy's Miserable Winners. It was in the Atlantic magazine in September of 2019. And the article starts with the assertion, the system that widened the gap between the rich and everyone else also has turned elite life into an endless, terrible competition. Maybe there's a way out. And this is, I think, one of the things that I never appreciated until I started reading some of this stuff. I always thought of the meritocracy, or a meritocratic-based educational system, as breaking down sort of an hereditary elite, as increasing mobility for less wealthy people, and increasing mobility overall. But in fact, and it was for a long time, over the last 20 to 30 years, it's begun to work in the opposite direction. It's begun to decrease mobility. And just a few statistics. Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, and Yale admit more students from families in the top 1% of the income brackets than students from families in the bottom 60% of the income brackets. SAT scores are 250 points higher for students whose families make more than $200,000 per year than families making between $40,000 and $60,000. So the meritocracy that we created that was intended to increase mobility has actually decreased, now is working in a way to decrease mobility. And there's a lot of explanations for that, but I don't have time to go into those. But not only is it decreasing mobility, but the meritocracy is actually causing problems for the people who are the beneficiaries of it. It's created so much pressure and competition that it's having adverse consequences on the people who are competing within it. A number of statistics here. Elite, middle, and high schools, in other words, the top middle and high schools, are requiring 3 to 5 hours of homework a night. And there've now been studies demonstrating that students in those schools are significantly sleep deprived as a consequence of that workload. Wealthy students have higher rates of drug and alcohol abuse than poor students. Wealthy students suffer depression and anxiety at triple the rates, or as much as triple the rates, of their peers throughout the country. Education competition increases as elite university acceptance rates decline from about 30% a few decades ago to less than 10%. Now, part of that decline is attributable to the fact that USA News and World Report college ranking system caused top students or people applying for college to apply more and more to the same top 10 schools identified in the US News and World Report rankings. And as more and more students flooded to those schools, of course, their acceptance rates went down because their class sizes couldn't increase to keep up with the increase in applicants. But nonetheless, for young people that are trying to get into college, it's increased the pressure on them and it's increased the competition. I found the next example in the University of Chicago surprising. In 1995, University of Chicago accepted 71% of its applicants. In 2019, it accepted 6%. And then other areas in which the competition and work ethic is created problems are in the legal profession, in investment banking, particularly during the merger and acquisition booms of the last 20 or 30 years. The workloads, back in the 1970s, 1960s, a law firm would expect lawyers to work about 1,300 hours a year. At the firm that I work on now, you're expected to work not less than 2,000 hours a year. If you're not in the office at least 1 or 2 nights a week and 1 or 2 days on the weekend, people start to wonder why is that person not working? And the same is true of investment banking. Amazon, I don't know if this is still their motto, but at one time it was, Their motto was, if you hit the wall, climb the wall. And so this has created problems. The existence of this highly competitive meritocracy is not only limited mobility for the people that are not in it, but it's made the people who are in it less and less happy. And this is an article that David Brooks, who's one of my favorite commentators, wrote almost 2 years ago now, The Moral Peril of Meritocracy. It was in the New York Times, April 7, 2019. And he's talking about, he says, and I think this is so true, and I wish we had more time to discuss this. He says, I've been describing moral renewal in personal terms, but of course whole societies and cultures can swap bad values for better ones. I think we all realize that the hatred, fragmentation, and disconnection in our society is not just a political problem. It stems from a moral and spiritual crisis. We don't treat one another well, and the truth is that 60 years of hyper-individualistic culture have weakened the bonds between people. They've dissolved the shared moral cultures that used to restrain capitalism and the meritocracy. A moral revolution points us to a different goal, not happiness, but joy. What is the difference? Happiness involves a victory for self. Joy involves the transcendence of self. Happiness is good, but joy is better. And what he's talking about in terms of this individualistic culture has happened on both sides of the political divide. On the left, we have created a tremendous, and I think happily for me, an appropriate emphasis on individual rights, but to a certain extent without realizing that there's a reciprocal side to that equation, that individualism, including even in terms of civil rights, has to be moderated to some extent by desire to maintain community. And I don't think the two are at odds. In fact, my daughter Sarah, who is about as strong a believer in individual rights as you can imagine, or civil rights, also thinks that her generation is hungry now for some form of community, some form of a way to bond. And it's sort of a sad, it's both sad and problematic that the form of bonding that is beginning to occur now is not occurring in churches or religions. It's occurring in political organizations. And so our need for group identity and for group being involved in a group, being part of a group that almost all of us need, is increasingly being met by political structures, not structures like a church or a community organization that might cut across political lines. And I think that's contributing to our divide. But on the left, there's an emphasis on individualism. On the right, there's also an emphasis on individualism in the free market orthodoxy of Milton Friedman and deregulated markets, where to a certain extent it's every man or corporation for itself. But again, there was a noticeable decline over the past 20 or 30 years. 70 years ago, if you said to the management of a major American corporation that you ought to take into account the needs of the community that you operate in, that corporation management would probably say, of course we should, and we do. by the late 1980s and early 1990s, the theory of free markets and the idea that pursuit of profit is the best form of social organization, which is what Milton Friedman argued. They've gotten to the point where if you said to management of most major corporations, you need to take into account the needs of the community you're located in, they would have told you not only shouldn't they do that, but it may well violate the law if they did, because their primary and maybe sole allegiance was to increase profits for the benefit of shareholders. And I'm involved in a number of different legal organizations right now where we're debating this issue of the reemergence of the doctrine that corporations should consider the needs of their communities, of their employees, of their suppliers, of their customers. I mean, it almost seems so much a part of common sense. You can't understand how anybody could think that any corporation for a sustainable period could ignore any or all of those things. But there's people that think they should, and there's people that think they have. But that's the hyper individualism that Brooks was talking about, that he thinks has shredded our culture and our community. And I remember when the pandemic started, David Brooks was talking about it early, and he said, I think this pandemic is going to measure whether or not we have enough social capital to pull together as a nation and address the problems of the pandemic. And I remember he was talking early on, probably in March, maybe early April, saying that he was pleasantly surprised how well the country was pulling together to address the pandemic. Well, now we know what's happened. What's happened is demonstrated that we have precious little social capital. And it's not all economic reasons that we've lost that social capital. In fact, they are part of it, but not all of it. And that's what I have. And I'm going to get out a screen share so I can see people. So,
thanks. You, Dave. You know, I just like to offer something. I think unrestrained anything is typically not the best idea. And certainly unrestrained capitalism is not the nirvana that people might hope for. And restraint might come about through regulation. And of course, there's a huge pushback against regulation, sometimes appropriate, sometimes not. But the other is financial. And I was intrigued when you were talking about how do we fund some of these programs that are needed, and you turned to debt as the solution. And I wonder where tax policy enters into this, because if you don't have a graduated tax, then every additional dollar that you make returns the same amount as the previous dollar. If you have a graduated tax rate, then there is a point of diminishing returns where just working more hours, earning more profit doesn't give you the advantage that your first dollar gave you. And it also has the wherewithal to fund programs without adding to the debt. And I forget what the numbers are, but it seems to me when I was a kid that the top incremental income tax rate was like 70% or some number like that. And corporate tax rates were higher. But it seems to me that the values embodied in shifting away from that the concept, there's no concept of enough. There's never enough. There's always more to be gotten. And it seems to me that certainly tax policy is one way of, as Eddie Glaude says, budgeting your values and making a real difference in ways that are marginally detrimental to that top 1%, but they're not going to be in bread lines. They're not going to wonder how to pay their rent. So it seems to me that that's a topic for conversation and an opportunity for meaningful change that would be hugely beneficial to the society.
I agree. I agree that we can increase revenues by tax policies to some extent. And just as a historical context, and these are going to be rough numbers, and anybody that has a more specific recollection than I do can correct me, but when Obama came into office, the annual federal deficit was about $1 trillion as a result of the financial collapse and TARP and the programs that were put in place. And over the course of the 8 years of Obama administration, we reduced that annual deficit to about, I think it was somewhere between 400 and 600 billion, which still sounds like a lot of money, but was a big improvement over the 1 trillion when he came into office. The Trump tax cuts increased the deficit. I think it went back up. I'm sure it went back up to $1 trillion. It may have gone higher than $1 trillion. Now, the thing about the Trump tax cuts is this is why if you listen to one side of the TV, you'll get one impression. You listen to another, you get a different. It's true that most of the tax cuts in the Trump tax cuts went to the wealthy. But that's because even with the low tax rates or the less than progressive tax rates that we have, the wealthy still pay most of our taxes. And so if you gave everybody the same level of tax reduction, what you could say about it from the Democratic side is you could say Trump passed a tax cut that mostly benefited the wealthy, because even if it was proportionate, it would still mostly benefit the wealthy since they pay most of the tax. And Trump could say, I gave a tax cut to the middle class. Now, what bothers me about the tax, and let me also say this about the progressivity of our tax rates, and I'm not sure of the precise numbers on this, but for instance, I think after World War II, the highest marginal rate was something like 90% for individuals. Mm-hmm. But if you actually went in and looked at what is the person in that tax bracket actually paying tax, when you take advantage of all the loopholes and deductions and the credits and the schemes that have been built into the tax code, you find out that they were actually paying a lot less than 90%. Usually, they were usually in the area of like 50% maybe. And
yeah, but they're not there now. And I'm not talking about the Trump tax cuts. I'm actually going back to Reagan, where this began. And it's not just the individual tax rates, it's the corporate tax rates. And if you talk about, as you did, some of the issues that corporations have with, well, why should I put any money into the community when it's going to reduce the profit and my return to shareholders, which is what I'm being measured on. It's the same issue. It's just like running for-profit prisons. Why would a for-profit prison invest a nickel in rehabilitation for an inmate? Yeah. Because it reduces the profit for shareholders. And oh my gosh, if you rehabilitate them, they might not come back to prison and I'm going to lose some of my revenue. I mean, the system is self-reinforcing in the context of the way that unrestrained capitalism works.
Yeah, look, I agree with you that I agree with you generally that unrestrained anything taken to an extreme ends up having counterproductive consequences. But let me go back to your question. The reason I talked about debt and monetary policy is that even if you increase taxes as Biden is proposing to do, which I'm in favor of, that won't come anywhere close to funding the kinds of needs we have. And let me tell you this, fiscal conservatives are fond of saying of the government can't run a deficit any more than you could run a deficit for your family. Your family has to balance their budget. The government should balance its budget. Wrong. Wrong. The right analogy is if your family had a gold mine in your basement and you could dig up gold any day and use it to pay for goods or services, then so long as people are still accepting your gold, you don't care whether your income equals your expenses. You cover the difference with the gold in your basement. Now, the government, in effect, has gold in the basement, except it's money creation. And when we went off the gold standard in 1972, 73, it was Nixon that took us off the gold standard, we freed up the Federal Reserve to create whatever amount of money it felt was correct. Now, there has been probably 1,000-year debate between people that are in favor of hard money, people that are in favor of soft money. And William Jennings Bryan was the perfect example in our history. Remember, don't crucify me on a cross of gold? What was that about? What that was about is that we had 40 years of deflation after the Civil War because we were on a gold standard. And the economy was growing and our ability to produce things were growing, but the amount of gold in circulation wasn't growing. Now, what William Jennings Bryan wanted to do was he wanted to use more silver as money and increase the money supply in order to increase our ability to buy what we could afford to produce. The proponents of the people that are concerned about the hard money people are typically those who have a lot of assets invested in financial instruments. If you got a financial instrument, you don't want the value of that dollar to go down. And so your preference is, I prefer monetary policy that assures me that the dollar is going to remain as valuable as possible. In fact, if the dollar went down and if we had deflation, I'd actually be richer because prices are going down, but my financial assets are staying the same. So I got $100 million in assets. As prices go down, my $100 million goes up. As prices go up, the value of my $100 million goes down. So people that have a lot of assets in financial instruments have a bias in favor of hard money. People that are in debt have a bias in favor of soft money. Create as much money as you want. The more inflation you create, the better off I am. Because you create, if inflation is occurring, my income's going up, but my debt load is staying the same. So this battle between hard money and soft money has been going on ever since debt was created and money was created. The thing that we are beginning to realize now is that after the financial crisis occurred in 08 and 09, all the fiscal conservatives said, oh my God, the Federal Reserve has created $600 billion of new money. They've just injected $600 billion into the economy. How did they do it? They bought up a lot of the souring loans and increased the money supply. And the fiscal conservatives said, oh my God, we're going to have inflation. Interest rates are going to start going back up again. This is terrible. We can't spend any more money. It didn't happen. Not only did we not have inflation, prices started to go down, interest rates were going down, and everybody's looking around going, how could the Federal Reserve inject $600 billion into the money system and it not produce inflation? Well, there's a lot of explanations for that, but we're beginning to realize that the Federal Reserve can put more money into the system than we ever appreciated. And when it comes to Biden's $1.9 trillion for the pandemic, that's going to be the battle line. It's going to be the Biden administration. And if you read these articles in the press, you can see that this battle has been going on now for years, but the battle's about to reach a crescendo probably. The Biden people are going to argue we have yet to reach the limit of the amount of money the Federal Reserve can produce. Last year, the Federal Reserve injected trillions of dollars into the money supply. The dollar did go down, but not too much. Inflation didn't go up because we can still produce more goods and services to meet whatever demand there is. But that's where the battle's going to be. The Biden administration will argue the Federal Reserve has got a lot of latitude to create money to fund all these programs we need to do. And the fiscal conservatives are going to say, well, yeah, maybe the Federal Reserve can create more money than we ever thought, but there is a limit and we're getting close. And when you hit it, you're not going to know you've hit it until it's too late. And that'll be the fight. And I think the Biden people are right about, and I think the chairman of the Federal Reserve believes the Biden people are right, that the Federal Reserve can produce a lot more money, particularly when demand is collapsing in other areas. So I shouldn't have, monetary policy is, I love it. So
I'm so sorry.
Anyway. The thing I wanted to show you, and I'll just tell you about it if you haven't seen it, the Philadelphia Symphony on Martin Luther King's birthday did a tremendous program. And one of the things they did was they performed Barber's Adagio for strings. I don't know if y'all are familiar with that piece, but I think it's one of the most beautiful pieces of music ever. And by the way, Barber lived in Westchester, Pennsylvania.
Really?
You can walk by his house just off the main street. And they paired that with Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, which I had never heard in full. I mean, I'd always heard famous bits of it, but I never heard it in full. It's extraordinary, and it's extraordinary how timely it is. And it's so beautiful when put to that music. So I would go on the Philadelphia Symphony Orchestra's website and find their MLK program. You'll also see them do a piece on We Shall Overcome. And while I'm busy raving about art, my last thing will say that Amanda Gorman she's got my vote for president. She's extraordinary. God.
Wasn't that something?
Oh, I feel sorry for Joe Biden because I thought he gave the speech of his life and one of the better inaugural dresses, and he was still upstaged by this 22-year-old.
If you haven't had a chance to watch it, Anderson Cooper did an interview with her today. That is well worth your time. So I commend that to you. Dave, back to your initial premise about the geographic differentiation, and we need to draw this to a close shortly. One of the things that I sensed from that comparison is that averages are being applied within the geography. And if you're doing averages of a small, relatively homogeneous population in rural areas versus a large non-homogeneous population in large metropolitan areas, there's probably a dichotomy between the upper end and the lower end in the large metropolitan areas, so that the statistics work out in the great gray average, but they don't work out if you look at the economic striations that exist in large metropolitan areas. Just a reflection.
I think I understand what you're saying. It's a good point. And what you're saying basically is if you've got 5 or 6 billionaires living in New York City, making $150 million or $200 million a year, which hedge fund managers make.
Well, even just the upper income people as compared to those that are at the lower edge. And the people at the lower edge have more in common with the people in the rural communities than they do with the others living in the large cities.
But I'll say this, one of the statistics I was showing you was average wage growth.
Uh-huh.
Now, I guess that could be skewed by having a few, 100 billionaires in New York City and no millionaires in Des Moines.
But you don't even need that. You just need a few million people making over $100,000. It doesn't take the multi-billionaires to skew that metropolitan number. It certainly helps, but that's not all of it.
Well, I don't have a mastery of the statistics well enough to say whether I understand hypothetically what you're saying could account for a difference. And I suppose it's possible, and there's the old adage, there's damn lies in statistics, but
yeah.
So I suppose it's possible that you could use statistics to try to portray.
You can prove anything with statistics. Yes, you can. Yes, you can.
But I got to say, I think there really is a economic divergence between the
I agree.
metropolitan areas and the rural.
I agree. Okay. I agree. I just think there's a little more nuance to the
it might not be as much as it might not be as much as one set of statistics would show.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for this. And I'm sorry, perhaps I've dominated the questions. That was Dave's presentation. Other comments or questions before we close?
Just thank you, Dave, for another really illuminating presentation.
Well, I don't know how illuminating it is, but thank you for attending. Let me say next week, the last one of these, thank God. I'm gonna try to talk about ways out, both by looking at some historical examples, good and bad, and discussing some big themes, and then talking about where we are right now in this political, social, economic process, and what the opportunities are, what the challenges are, and then that'll be it for me. I'll shut up about this for another 10 years.
No, this is great, and I think we're all looking forward to this. So what are we going to do about it? That's kind of the fundamental question. Here's where we are for a variety of reasons in a variety of circumstances, but where are we going from here? So we'll look forward to that. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks, everybody, and check out that. Check out the Philadelphia Symphony. It's really a beautiful piece.
All right. Night, everybody.
Night. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.
Night.